Operation Fenkil, the beginning of the end for Ethiopian occupation in Eritrea. On February 10, 1990, Operation Fenkil delivered a crushing blow to Ethiopia's military occupation in Eritrea, liberating the strategic port city of Massawa and setting the stage for Eritrea's final victory.
ጅግና ህዝባዊ ሰራዊት ሓርነት ኤርትራ ሎሚ ቀትሪ ንከተማ ምጽዋዕ ተቆጻጺርዋ ህዝባዊ ሰራዊት ቅድሚ ሒደት ሰዓታት ናብ ምጽዋዕ ብዓወት ዝኣተወ ኣብ መስመር ኣስመራ ምጽዋዕ ከምኡውን ኣብታ ከተማን ከባቢኣን ንዝነበረ ገዚፍ ሰራዊት ኢትዮጵያ ብምትምሳል
Just over a year later, on May 24, 1991, Eritrea would achieve total military victory over the Ethiopian army in Eritrea, permanently breaking free from Ethiopia's illegal annexation and occupation. The name Fenkil, meaning uproot in Tigrinya, was a fitting symbol for the operation. It did not just reclaim Massawa, it uprooted Ethiopian proxy colonial rule, shattered the Dergue's military stronghold, and dismantled the myth of Ethiopian control over Eritrean land and sea. More than just a military triumph, Operation Fenkil was the embodiment of Eritrea's unwavering resistance against oppression. It showed that Eritreans never surrender. They fight, they endure, and finally they win. Massawa's liberation was not a mere territorial victory. It was the definitive proof that Ethiopia's claim to the Red Sea was an illusion, one that was erased in just 59 hours by the disciplined and battle-hardened forces of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF. From the trenches of Naqfa in the northern region of Sahel, to the stunning victory at Af'abat, to the decisive lightning strike at Massawa, Eritrean history has consistently taught a single lesson. Invaders are not reasoned with. They are vanquished and buried. A defining moment in Eritrean history, Operation Fenkil was a triumph of will over firepower, of strategy over huge numbers and brute force. The liberation of Massawa cut off Ethiopia's last remaining supply line to Asmara through the Red Sea, dealing a fatal blow to the Dergue regime's remaining forces in Eritrea. Breaking the chains of neocolonialism. Massawa was one of the most vital ports on the Red Sea. It had long been a target for colonial and imperial ambitions of foreign powers, from the Ottomans and Italians to the British and Ethiopians. When Emperor Haile Selassie annexed Eritrea in 1962, Ethiopia claimed Massawa as its own, attempting to rewrite history. However, the people of Eritrea refused to accept colonial rule and waged a 30-year-long armed struggle to reclaim their land. Operation Fenkil was the decisive moment that severed Ethiopia's grip on Eritrea's coastline. The Ethiopian army, long believed to be Africa's largest and strongest, and backed by Soviet firepower and Western economic, political, and diplomatic support, was humiliated in battle. Over 18,000 Ethiopian soldiers were either killed or captured as their defenses crumbled. Massawa's liberation crushed Ethiopia's expansionist colonial ambitions, proving once and for all that Eritrea was not a land to be conquered. Massawa's liberation was more than a military victory. It was a death knell to the Dergue regime. By capturing Massawa, the EPLF cut off Ethiopia's last major supply route to Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, choking off the Dergue's ability to reinforce its forces in Eritrea. Ethiopia had relied on Massawa for trade and military logistics supply. But with its fall, the Dergue was left isolated and weakened. Beyond its military and economic implications, the fall of Massawa delivered a devastating psychological blow to Ethiopia. For the first time, the Dergue realized that its defeat was inevitable and that its days were numbered. The psychological impact of this victory shattered Ethiopian army's morale, accelerating the total collapse of the Dergue, Mengistu Haile Mariam's military junta in Ethiopia, just over a year later. Massawa was not handed to Eritrea. It was won through the blood and sacrifice of Eritrea's brave fighters. Every square inch of land was paid for in martyrdom, ensuring that no foreign power would ever again set foot on Eritrean soil without facing dire consequences. The thousands of heroic Eritrean sons and daughters who fell before and during Operation Fenkil, as well as in the defense of Massawa at the Ginda front and in subsequent battles, cemented Eritrea's sovereignty with their lives. Ethiopia's leaders, past and present, should remember the fate of those who tried to seize Eritrean land and sea. If history did not teach them in 1961 to 1991, and later in 1998 to 2000, and again recently in 2020 to 2022, then any future reckless attempt against Eritrea's sovereignty will only end in another crushing defeat. The ghosts of Nado, Fenkil, Badme, Igremachel, Adibagi'o, and Bure still haunt Ethiopia, whispering a clear warning. Eritrea does not bow, does not surrender. It fights, it wins, and it keeps what is rightly its own. Overview of Ethiopia's fortification of Massawa. Understanding Massawa's strategic importance, Ethiopia's 606 Corps was tasked to defending it. To this end, it had transformed the city into a military fortress with 3 layers of defense. The Corps consisted of 3 divisions, the 22nd, the 10th, and the 6th, comprising of 14 infantry brigades reinforced by mechanized units. The 6th Division comprised 5 infantry brigades, 500, 83rd, 113th, 112th, and 21st, reinforced by the 66th Tank Battalion, which was equipped with 12 tanks. Additionally, it was supported by the 67th Artillery Battalion, armed with 11 122mm artillery guns, and the 68th Anti-Aircraft Battalion, which operated 5 37mm guns and 4 23mm guns. Second, the 44th Tank Brigade was equipped with 61 tanks, 12 122mm artillery guns, 20 57mm artillery guns, and 75 additional heavy weapons. Third, the 302nd Motorized Brigade operated 8 heavy guns, 4 anti-tank missiles, 151 Bren guns, and 1,288 light arms. Fourth, the 106th Tank Battalion was armed with 11 tanks. Fifth, the 92nd BM Battery Unit and the 262nd BM Battery Unit were each equipped with 4 BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers. Beyond the forces within the 606 Corps, several additional units operated under the direct command of the 2nd Revolutionary Army of the Dergue in Eritrea. The Zerai Daras 29th Mechanized Brigade, stationed at Gahtelai and Maiwui, was equipped with 14 tanks, 7 85mm artillery guns, and 5 additional heavy weapons. The 27th Mechanized Brigade, responsible for defending Massawa and Foro, was armed with 68 different kinds of tanks and 8 85mm artillery guns. 2 brigades from the 3rd Mechanized Division were positioned at Dogali. Additionally, 2 other brigades from the 106th Mechanized Division were also stationed in Asmara as reserve forces. The Ethiopian Navy, with a force of 3,000 personnel, operated 7 squadrons consisting of 30 large, medium, and small warships. Finally, the Ethiopian Air Force, based in Asmara and Debre Zeit, was equipped with a fleet of Soviet-supplied MiG-21, MiG-23, and MiG-29 fighter jets, as well as Mi-24 attack helicopters. In total, Ethiopia's military arsenal on the Massawa front included about 150 tanks, 70 130mm and 122mm artillery guns, numerous BM-21 multiple rocket launchers, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and a total force exceeding 25,000 troops. The Ethiopian army had spent years fortifying Massawa, believing it to be impregnable. A 100-kilometer-long defensive network, strengthened by concrete bunkers and trenches, stretched from Menteble in the foothills of the Semenawi Bahri escarpment to Mberemi on the Red Sea coast north of Massawa. The first defensive line ran from Mberemi to the heights of Sakar, the Ila Gamad Pass, and the Kantebai Hills before extending to Shabah, Sukhur, Afgargar, all the way to Menteble. A second arc of defense, reinforced with landmines and tank traps, was constructed at Addi Ile, the command and control center of Ethiopia's 6th Infantry Division, Addi Shuma, Gahtelai, Digdikta, Mai Atal, Dogali, and Forto. With Ethiopian troops positioned on elevated terrain overlooking the vast plains below, every movement of the Eritreans, the EPLF, was monitored, making an assault appear nearly impossible. The third and internal arc of defense was around the perimeter of Massawa's islands and the Ethiopian naval base. Fenkil, the EPLF's unstoppable offensive. Against this heavily fortified enemy, the EPLF launched a daring and meticulously planned and coordinated assault with 13,500 fighters. Its forces included 3 brigades from the 85th Infantry Division, 3 from the 70th Division, 2 brigades from the 61st Division, 1 from the 96th Infantry Division, and 3 brigades from the 74th Mechanized Division that was armed with 45 tanks, 31 mortars, 4 BM-21 multiple rocket launchers, and 20 anti-tank missiles. Though vastly outgunned, the EPLF's superior strategy, discipline, and courage turned the tide of battle. Eritrea's young navy, though small, played a crucial role with 10 speedboats supporting the operation. At exactly 1 a.m. on 8 February 1990, Operation Fenkil began. The attack unfolded in 4 well-coordinated prongs. The first prong, EPLF forces targeted Ethiopian defenses at Menteble, Gerger, Sarak, and Marat, clearing the Shabah-Gahtelai road for mechanized movement. Their next objective was to cut off reinforcements from Fulfil Solomona by seizing Tsahaflam and Debre Ma'ar passes. The second prong, a stealth force infiltrated enemy lines through the river Abha, bypassing the first defensive line without firing a single shot. They struck Ethiopian positions at Kentebai, Figret, and Sukhur before rapidly capturing the 6th Division Command Center at Addi Ile and blocking the Asmara-Massawa road at Gahtelai. These objectives were completed by the end of February 8. The third prong. By February 9th, Ethiopian positions along the coast from Kentebai to Imberemi had been completely neutralized, enabling EPLF forces to push forward toward Gurgusum. Meanwhile, a segment of the force that had cut off the Asmara-Massawa road at Gahtelai advanced swiftly towards Digdikta, while the other contingent cleared enemy resistance from the 2 Dongolos, effectively sealing off all Ethiopian reinforcement attempts from Asmara at Ginda. The fourth prong. Eritrea's navy launched a 2-pronged assault, one force striking Ethiopian warships around Massawa from Marsa Ibrahim from the north, while another stationed at Ingel were waiting to block reinforcements arriving by sea from Assad. The fall of Massawa and Ethiopia's catastrophic defeat. On February 10, 1990, the final phase of Operation Fenkil began. EPLF forces advancing through Digdigta stormed and captured key Ethiopian strongholds, including Massawa Fort, Umkulu, Hutumlo, Amatere, Hidaga, and the outskirts of the Sigalet Bridge. Simultaneously, another force advancing through Gurgusum crushed Ethiopian resistance, reaching the gates of Massawa. By February 11, the Ethiopian naval base had fallen, resulting in the capture of over 1,000 Ethiopian soldiers, including 2 high-ranking generals at the base. Fearing total destruction, the remaining Ethiopian warships retreated to the Dahlag archipelago. Meanwhile, EPLF tank units fought a fierce and relentless battle to breach the heavily fortified 900-meter-long Sigalet Causeway. Encouraged by the perceived strength of this defensive position, an Ethiopian general entrenched himself on Tuwalet Island, taking the local civilian population hostage and refusing to surrender. Between February 12 and 15, there was a pause in fighting in Massawa as the EPLF engaged in negotiations to secure the release of the hostages. When talks failed, EPLF launched a daring amphibious assault, transporting fighters by speedboats to neutralize the Ethiopian forces. Realizing that the battle was finally lost, the hostage-taking general and about 150 of his officers were killed in fierce battle at Tuwalet. The operation was a complete success. Massawa was fully liberated permanently, severing Ethiopia's hold on Eritrea's coastline. The Ethiopian army suffered devastating losses. 18,000 Ethiopian soldiers were either killed, wounded, or captured. 130 Ethiopian tanks fell into EPLF hands. 8 BM-21 multiple rocket launchers were captured. 70 artillery pieces, 122mm, 85mm, and 76mm, were seized. Over 100 heavy anti-aircraft guns were also taken. Ethiopian savagery, aerial bombardment, and civilian massacre. Following the EPLF's liberation of Massawa in February 1990, the Ethiopian Air Force launched a brutal bombing campaign in a desperate attempt to reclaim the city and punish Eritrean civilians. The attacks were marked by indiscriminate bombings of residential areas, markets, and infrastructure using cluster bombs, napalm, and conventional explosives. Key targets included the port, oil storage facilities, and civilian neighborhoods, while the historic Ottoman-era buildings in the old town of Massawa were reduced to rubble. Cluster bombs struck markets and refugee camps of the displaced population of the port city, killing hundreds, while survivors reported widespread use of napalm, which set fires across the city. The sustained bombardment between February and May of 1990 saw nearly daily raids, with the Ethiopian Air Force focused on denying the EPLF use of the port and terrorizing civilians. The Ethiopian Air Force also targeted water supplies and food storage sites, aiming to induce famine. February 15 to 16, 1990. Over 30 sorties dropped incendiary bombs on residential districts, including the densely populated Mberemi and Gurgusum areas. March 1990. A bombing raid on a market killed approximately 200 civilians in a single strike. April 1990. Massawa was bombed 13 times throughout the month. Here is a sample. April 4, 1990. In the Khutmiya section of the city, 35 civilians were killed and 100 others injured. April 6, 1990. Inside the Bazar area, 12 civilians were killed and 45 were wounded. April 7, 1990. Bombings in Amatere, Tualet, and Ferrovia killed 25 people and injured 75. April 22, 1990. At 6:15 p.m., 2 cluster bombs exploded over a busy street in the heart of Massawa, near Cinema Aida and the surrounding areas, as civilians had emerged from their bomb shelters and were on the streets. The bombing killed 50 people and injured 110, many with severe wounds. The attack was documented by Canadian filmmaker Yvonne Patry and featured on ABC's Nightline with Ted Koppel. The footage captured scenes so harrowing that many of the images, filmed by EPLF journalists, were too graphic to share with any audience that values human life. October 1990. A napalm attack on a fishing village near Massawa killed over 150 civilians. Around 80% of Massawa's population fled to rural areas or EPLF-held zones to escape the relentless aerial bombings of the Ethiopian Air Force. Massawa's suffering under Ethiopian bombardment remains a somber chapter in Eritrea's struggle, immortalized in the phrase, "They bombed the stones, but not our spirits." The Ethiopian Air Force use of cluster bombs and heavy munitions in densely populated areas caused widespread death and devastation. These attacks were part of a broader strategy to terrorize the civilian population and disrupt the economy, including targeting food relief efforts. The Ethiopian military used Soviet and Israeli-supplied cluster bombs designed to maximize civilian harm by scattering submunitions and napalm to destroy homes and ignite fires in the port city. Survivors described the sticky flames as melting skin and causing horrific injuries. As the EPLF advanced toward Asmara, Ethiopia intensified its air raids with Soviet-made Antonov bombers conducting nighttime strikes that often hit civilian shelters. Overall, between 2,000 and 3,000 civilians were killed indirectly by Ethiopian bombings, while over 10,000 were wounded, many maimed by cluster munitions or suffering severe burns from napalm. Despite the extensive destruction, the bombings failed to break the Eritrean resolve. Instead, they exposed Ethiopia's brutality and galvanized support from the Eritrean diaspora. The attacks highlighted Ethiopia's reliance on collective punishment a strategy that ultimately backfired, uniting Eritreans even further. The international community's silence in the face of Ethiopia's disregard for civilian safety and international humanitarian law exposed the hypocrisy of the world, particularly the Western powers led by the United States, that failed to hold Ethiopia accountable for its actions. Ginda, the unyielding shield that defended Massawa. Liberating Massawa was a monumental feat, but holding it against relentless enemy offensives demands even greater sacrifice. After the liberation of Massawa, the EPLF established its defensive line at Ginda, approximately 40 kilometers from Asmara and 68 kilometers from Massawa. In the 3 months between February 9 and May 11, 1990, the Ginda front became the site of some of the fiercest battles of the war, exacting a devastating toll on both sides. Defending Massawa at Ginda front cost the EPLF nearly 3,000 lives, 3 times the number of fighters martyred in the battle to liberate the port city. However, the enemy suffered far greater losses, with over 30,000 Ethiopian soldiers killed. Desperate to reclaim Massawa, the Ethiopian army launched 7 major offensives in an attempt to break through EPLF defenses before the EPLF's southern front was fully opened in the summer of 1990, with the liberation of San'afe, Dergue, and the approach to Dergue. These offensives, documented in Ethiopian military records, include the February 10 to 12 assault, Operation Massawa, Operation Demmelash, Avenger, Operation Gesses, Reprimand, Operation Aden, Save, Operation Betis, Punch, the Battle of Seminawi Bahri. The sheer intensity of these battles was reflected in the scale of Ethiopia's artillery bombardment. On a daily basis, the enemy rained down an estimated 5,000 shells, including 130 millimeter, 122 millimeter, 85 millimeter, and 76 millimeter artillery rounds, as well as BM-21 and BM-24 multiple rocket launchers. In addition, over 10,000 mortar rounds were fired in a desperate bid to crush Eritrean defenses. Despite the overwhelming firepower and continuous offensives, the EPLF held its ground, ensuring that Massawa remained liberated. The sacrifices made at the Ginda front solidified the gains of Operation Fenkil, proving once again that Eritrea's freedom was not simply won, it was fiercely defended at all costs. A warning to would-be invaders. Despite the false narratives propagated by Ethiopia ad nauseam, there is no historical evidence to support the presence of Abyssinians along the Red Sea following the collapse of the Aksumite Empire in the 10th century of the Common Era. The only notable exception occurred during the proxy occupation of Eritrea from 1962 to 1991, driven by Cold War dynamics and the strategic significance of the Red Sea. Operation Fenkil firmly established that this historical reality would remain unchanged. Ethiopia's aspirations to possess Eritrean ports are mere illusions destined to end in failure. Eritrea's coastline is not a negotiable asset. It is the lifeblood of Eritrea, fiercely protected by the sacrifice of its heroes. The Eritrean coast of the Red Sea belongs to Eritrea, and let this be a notice. No amount of falsified narrative, harangue about emotional water, threat of millions marching to the sea, and scheming and screaming in Addis Ababa will change that fact. Those who challenge this truth will find their ambitions buried in Massawa's and Asab's sons, just as the Dergue's forces were in 1990 and the forces of the TPLF were annihilated in the sand dunes of Fenkil in 1998 to 2000. Massawa and Asab stand as permanent testament to Eritrean resilience, monuments to the sacrifices of those who refuse to give a square inch of their sovereign land and sea coast. Operation Fenkil should be Ethiopia's wake-up call, a brutal reminder that Eritrea is not a land to be conquered, but a fortress of resistance. Massawa's liberation 35 years ago was not just about reclaiming a port. It was about proving that Eritrea's sovereignty is absolute and irreversible. Ethiopia's leaders would be wise to study history before daring to covet Eritrean ports again and embark on reckless expansionist dreams. Fenkil shattered their empire, and any future attempt will meet an even swifter demise. Ethiopia's leaders, past, present, and future, should remember the lesson of Fenkil. Eritrea's ports were never Ethiopia's to lose, and they will never be Ethiopia's to take. Operation Fenkil 35 years ago was a lesson written in blood, one that Ethiopia cannot afford to forget. Eritrea's independence is permanent, its resolve unbreakable, and its Red Sea untouchable. Let history be the judge. Those who challenge Eritrea's sovereignty will meet the same fate as the Dergue and the TPLF, crushed, humiliated, and thrown into the dustbin of history.
مأتوي تحري شبت نتوالد بغرس مدري عادات زي بلكا نخلو تعلي فانكلي لو مخاي فانكلا بدهري فانكلي لو مخاي فانكلا بدهري اترسم وايلا نسمهار كتكلا بمريت ببحري مأتوي تحري شبت نتوالد دغدغ رأس مدري عادات زي بلكا نخلو تعلي فاكلي لو مخاي فاكلا بدهري فاكلي لو مخاي فاكلا بدهري حبري محتاب معدو دنس مدافع كبحتو عجب لقولي مسفورتو معسكر كوينة نكوتو وقعي كيامبر تاشتو للاي زبيت كيامبر تاشتو أكل كانيرو مدفعينيا صبوك زنزر تانكينيا محتاق دعونا بفردي ورا تنيرن صعبتي ورا تنيرن صعبتي أي مبات يعيد ورتي أما كل قرقسو أي نبسالينا ما لو تنزل تريد حوعي زكرس بحري بحريات ورواري فتان تتعيب نبات